Welcome to week 10, everybody. Jumping right into the work that we have in front of us this week. We're still working with the yellow wallpaper. Only this time, what we're doing with it is we're looking into kind of not the history of the story itself, but the world that generated the story and the people that generated the story and the sort of social, historical context that we can use as critics to illuminate themes within the story. So, The Yellow Wallpaper, which we all read for last week, is a story about a woman living in the 1890s, sort of late Victorian era America, who is being treated for exhaustion and depression and anxiety. At least that's what the straightforward explanation is, although we know she just had a baby, so it's very likely that she was also suffering from a form of postpartum depression as well. And so the treatment that she was given in the story by a doctor named Silas Weir is the rest treatment, which involved basically just you weren't allowed to work, you weren't allowed to lift a finger around the house, you weren't allowed to do creative things, you basically just had to rest. You had your diet severely restricted, and you weren't really allowed to do much of anything besides just kind of lay there. And the author of the story herself was inspired to write this story because she was treated by Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Silas Ware Mitchell, who was very well known and a profound advocate for what he referred to as the rest cure. It became a somewhat controversial treatment for women at the time, and now it's basically unheard of. You rest when you're sick, but the idea that resting involves no creativity, no company, no interaction, no stimulation, no work whatsoever, to treat long-term symptoms of psychological issues, that's just not done these days. And not only is just sort of thinking about what it is like to be a woman in the 1890s, which none of us ever were or have been or ever could be, which is why we need to do research to talk about these things. But beyond what we may just sort of broadly know and assume life was like for women at this time, we can look at the story, we can do research, we can sort of explore historically what life was like for women at the time and use ideas from real world history and discussion to examine what's going on in the yellow wallpaper. And all of a sudden what the story becomes is so much more than just a ghost story. It's deeply symbolic of just what it's like to live in a society where you essentially don't have much agency, where if you are a woman, you have very few options. Most women choose to get married, and most marriages at the time involved subservience and just having your life and your daily routine and everything about you kind of just dictated by what it is your husband is doing. There's, varying levels of extremity with that, but by and large, that was the social expectation of women at the time. And so the story becomes, a little bit more clearly a discussion of what it's like for somebody who doesn't get to make their own choices, is sort of treated like a child constantly, someone who isn't listened to, and just the stress and the strain that can put on somebody who is going through that. In very broad terms, we can, use our knowledge of what life was like and written documentation from people who actually lived at the time and historical accounts and all kinds of research that we can, sort of expand upon or use to expand upon those thematic discussions in the story. For this week's work, the specific aspect of the context of the story that I would like to explore is the actual writings from Dr. Ware Mitchell. And I have uploaded a couple links to Google Docs, and I will enumerate the pages that I will ask you to read of that, where he very directly speaks about his mindset and what his overall concerns are when it comes to how he treats women. There are two books. There's Wear and Tear, and there's Doctor and Patient. And I'm not asking you to read both of all the books, although they are both, relatively short. I'm asking you to read selected pages, and those pages are pretty decently indicated in the actual Google document itself, with lines in the margin sort of drawing the eye to the parts that I'm really trying to focus on. But in a nutshell, what he sees as the most important aspect of the treatment of women is to bring them back in line with their moral duties as a woman. And this is not me conjecturing. These are some of the words that you will see he actually wrote with his own hands. He sort of saw the main crisis that faced women that he treated as being a moral failing, as trying too hard to be like a man, trying too hard to do things that a woman is just naturally incapable of doing for a wide variety of reasons, and specifically beyond just sort of the general idea of women in the 1890s America. I'm looking at, let's examine this story through the lens of a doctor who treated the author of this story. And as you see the themes being sort of laid out in the story, the discussion that the story is trying to have, not just about the broad theme of women's studies of the time, but within the specific theme of how this man treated her and what it did, and how he looks at women, and how the way he looks at women guided him towards this idea as being ideal for treatment. It's fascinating stuff, and by many accounts, there are things that he says that we would find comically old-fashioned. Old-fashioned is a very polite term, but I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to let you read the words. I will outline the specific pages that I would like for you to read, and then the goal for this week's discussion, there's no reading quiz, but the goal for this week's discussion is to speak about the themes of the story using your knowledge of what Dr. Ware Mitchell said in his writings. More descriptive discussion or detailed instructions will be on the discussion post, but for right now, that's the main gist of it. In the meanwhile, if you have any questions about any of this, just reach out and let me know. You should be trying to figure out which story you would like to do research on. And figuring that out basically involves which story speaks to things that you would like to look into more. Which story is speaking to an idea that you think is, first of all, researchable, because not every idea really is. But also, which idea just sort of intrigues you enough to want to learn more about it and want to see more about what the story may actually be saying about this thing. So, all kinds of ideas are on the table for each of these stories. Some ideas are more fertile than others, where some may be a little bit more pointedly discussing a couple of particular things. But in each of these stories, there are ideas that aren't just talked about in stories, that are talked about in the world, that are talked about in politics, that are talked about in social sciences, that are talked about in actual sciences, physical sciences. So let me know if you're having any trouble brainstorming for that. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your week, and let me know if I can be of any assistance.